The last thing that you start to see, we're starting to see now, which is the recasting of criticism as espionage and dissent as treason. The fact that the Senate voted to censure Move On, I mean, I didn't like that ad, but it is such a classic warning sign of a closing society when the state starts to censor speech and starts to target organizations of dissidents for state censure. And what's very disturbing is, you know, Hillary Clinton, but it could be anyone, criticizing the war is called traitor, traitor, traitor. And if you look at Stalin and if you look at Hitler, and what they did was that they began to expand and expand the definition of terrorist. And we're seeing that with the rephrasing of sort of animal liberation attacks against property as terrorism, those expanded sentences. But you also start to see more and more people and activities being called treason, traitorous, terrorism, sabotage, espionage. And the final step is to subvert the rule of law, and or to make it easier to declare martial law. And again, activists all over the world know what a foolish mistake it is to pass something like the 2007 Defense Authorization Act that gives the president, it makes it easier for him to declare martial law.
I think even if one agrees with the characterization of the 10 steps, the natural question is, why do you think the threat is as imminent as you think that it is to warrant a comparison of America to Nazi Germany?
Yeah, and let me stress again for people who are just paying attention that I really want to stress that what I'm looking at when I look at Germany isn't Nazi outcomes. It's not, I'm not saying we're going to have crematoria or we're going to have, you know, a regime, you know, that's so far from what I'm saying. What I'm saying is much more considered and very right, which is that there are certain tactics that have been developed and are time-tested in closing down a modern constitutional democracy. And there are two places where this happened, in Italy and Germany, that we can learn from. And we're seeing, if you look at 1931, 1932, the beginning of 1933, you'll see things recur, and we owe it to the victims of that Holocaust to learn the lessons of history. And why do I think it's so urgent? Here's why. It's a very good question. What most people think is that democracy is strong, and so if there's a closing down, that it goes like this, like a diagonal line on a chart, and that we've got time to stabilize and react. That's not how it works. History shows that democracies close down in a series of what Malcolm Gladwell would call tipping points, and that when certain things start to happen, when certain tipping points have been reached, things start to close down very fast. So there was one such tipping point when we legalized torture, and we don't have to revisit that. We did legalize torture. The second tipping point was when we gave the president the right to say that he can call any of us an enemy combatant. So what happens in a democracy under sustained assault is that there will be a sudden series of events, the tasering of that kid, Andrew Meyer, in Florida. Now, I wasn't surprised to find out that it was Florida, because again, I've read Goebbels. Gainesville is a state university. State university is answerable to a board of regents. The board of regents is answerable to the state legislator, which is answerable to Jeb Bush. So what you start
He's no longer the governor.
You know, Florida is a scene of many, many kinds of systematic defenses of these power grabs by people who are supportive of this administration, of their goals. What you must know from closing societies is that you don't need the same people to be technically in power to have cronies exerting power. I mean, that's why what happened with the U.S. Attorney's scandal is so disturbing. There's evidence that the emails the White House doesn't want to disclose are going to show that there was a discussion of purging all of the U.S. attorneys at once. And I'm not surprised they don't want to show those emails. That's what Goebbels did in April of 1933. And you know that in a closing society, it's a classic tactic. You purge the civil service of independent thinkers. You focus especially on lawyers and judges. That's what Goebbels did. And then you don't need a coup, because in a close election, if that had happened, it would be the end of America, essentially. It would be over. Because in a close election, the U.S. attorneys are the ones who have the power to go after and investigate voting rights groups, and who have the power to really, in a closing society, you will still have elections. You just won't have free elections. You won't have uncorrupted elections.
Are you arguing a little bit too much here? Because if my memory serves right, it was President Clinton and Attorney General Reno when in 1992 that unprecedentedly asked for resignation of all 92 U.S. attorneys. So what was contemplated in this case actually was effectuated in prior times, and I don't think that was a tipping point. No, I think that was just a natural exercise of policy-making authority by the victorious president.
You know, I totally see your point, and if this administration and its enablers in Congress, Democrat and Republican, weren't so consistently dismantling checks and balances, I would agree with you. But, you know, when you ask what is the urgency, that's one more signal, you know, that and the fact that, you know, increasingly people are finding themselves under investigation if they give money to Democratic groups. You know, there's this politician in prison in Alabama for what looks like politically motivated prosecution. I mean, it's the big picture. And when you say, why is it so urgent, here's why. We're at a point where, I mean, if you look at these other closing societies, they do something that's always the same. They start with torturing brown people, right? They start with torturing people who are defined as alien or other that most of mainstream society doesn't identify with. Muslims, non-English speakers. You know, in Germany they started with anarchists, communists, homosexuals, gypsies, Jews, okay? But then what they always do is once that's established and once society tolerates that, always they start to blur the line. Always they start to incrementally go after, start to arrest, start to abuse people at the heart of civil society. And then at a certain point, there's a targeting or a series of arrests. And right now, so I'm a journalist, so right now we have all the pieces in place so that tomorrow morning I could wake up and read in the Washington Post that half of the editors and reporters of the Washington Post have been charged under the 1917 Espionage Act if they revealed classified information. Or I could wake up and find that the heads of Move On and various environmental groups and the ACLU have been called enemy combatants for their activities. And, you know, they'll get out eventually, or they'll be able to talk to their lawyers eventually, but for right now, they're in solitary confinement. And if I were to read that tomorrow, this is how fast a society closes down, that when we're at the point we're at of these various checks and balances being so weakened, destroyed. When that starts to happen, when it starts to threaten ordinary people, like you should have heard the conversations I had after the tasering of this student. People were terrified. Some people were saying, okay, now I'm scared to speak up in public, and other people were saying, no, you have to speak up more now because it's just going to embolden them. But when you start to have certain things like people start, I mean, you could plot it on a timeline. I could have told you last year that people would start to get hurt for asking questions by now because the blueprint is predictive. And so what is predictive is that you give any executive, it could be a President Hillary, and the founders knew this, absolute power corrupts, and it just keeps corrupting. It corrupts good people. That's why they put in place checks and balances. If you give any president the power to round up people and call them an enemy combatant and lock them up, then that stills dissent quickly. After those arrests happen, if I read about it, America will still have the New York Times and the Washington Post. We'll still have American Idol and internet shopping. What we won't have is liberty, because I will not be having this conversation with you the week after those arrests take place, because I'll be too scared. I'm a mother of two. I'm not that brave.
The president, as he has asserted, Congress has acquiesced, and the Supreme Court has recognized, and as you criticize, has the power to arrest and detain persons, including U.S. citizens, as enemy combatants.
If they're innocent, because it's a status offense.
But the Supreme Court also has, in my view, wisely set up procedures whereby the accused person would be able to challenge the specific evidence of course, but that isn't that a reaffirmation? Isn't that a reaffirmation of the process? And indeed, even though the president has very loudly asserted his power, there are only a handful, 3 the persons designated as enemy combatants who are U.S. Who are U.S. citizens. Does the natural check of the electorate, does the natural respect for democracy and the opinions of the people serve as a way in order to constrain governmental power and official action?
You know, this is very scary because, as you know, if the only thing restraining a president, any president, from arresting other U.S. citizens as enemy combatants is his or her worry about the opinions of the people.
Or respect for the Constitution.
Yeah, but the founders knew that opinions weren't enough and that good wishes weren't enough. And the founders knew that if you give anyone the kind of power to intimidate and round up the opposition, they're going to use it. I mean, you know, the Federalist Papers were written in a spirit that we need to remember. The founders were scared. They were scared because they knew without a question that an American despot could arise in America to oppress Americans.